My name is Jack Latham. I'm 79. I've trained as an engineer and have worked in local industry for some years before joining my father in his business.
Tell us about the early years that you remember your father.
Well, my earliest remembrance of father was during the war. He was sent, after Dunkirk, he was demobilised and Marconi sent him to the factory in Fulham. They had a factory there with 2 or 3 other lads from Chelmsford, New Street, and they took over the factory to get it running efficiently and 24/7 actually. And I've got photographs of the bedrooms built in the workspace for them to sleep overnight so that the work continued. There was no stop to it all. And I can remember, I was only a youngster then, I was coming 3 years old I suppose, and what I do remember, we were living in a flat nearby, and every time the siren went, I didn't wake up, but I did when Mother grabbed me, picked me up, wrapped a blanket around me, and down underneath the block of flats there was shelters, and we were there. Yes, I can remember the bombing. I can remember if I'd been out shopping with Mother in London, coming back on the tube, we'd get off the tube at Parsons Green, and you didn't have much room to walk because already, once the schools were out, everybody headed downstairs to the railway stations to get a place to sleep, because the vast majority of the population didn't have shelters available to them apart from under the stairs. And they would come down there with their children and get their blankets going, and there was always a bit of music going, and there was food around being cooked. And it was difficult for the passengers to get off and make their way off the platform, you know, but everybody took it in their stride. So I can remember those days happily. And I remember one Christmas, I was with Father, we went to Hamlin's, I think it was a very famous toy shop in London. And they'd got a big model there of a German city with all sort of factories, little models, and there was this plane on a cord that ran across it, and to raise money to build Spitfires and heavens knows what else for the war effort, for sixpence you could drop a bomb from this little plane that came down onto the buildings and pretend that you're actually blowing up German industry. I do remember that. And that was very popular, you know, that everybody felt they were genuinely doing something to keep it all going. And then I started primary school there as well, in St Maurice Convent School, which was opposite where we lived. And they're all nuns and priests, because I was a Catholic. And now I think it's the Kensington Prep School, so I can say that I attended the Kensington Prep School. But then we came back to Chelmsford, Father. This would be 44 time. The war was going our way. We were in Europe, and Dad and the lads were brought back from Chelmsford to New Street, and that's where Dad picked up what he was doing.
His war service was outstanding.
Well, Father, on this family photograph, is here. He was a young second lieutenant by the end of the war. This is other brother, Frederick, and Ernest. They all served, as did my mother's brothers. They all served as well. They all did their bit. He volunteered into the Territorial Force in 1915, and he was turned down initially because he was underage. But lo and behold, he went back like many other lads did and gave false age and re-signed again. Well, they detected him quick enough, so they wrote to his father, and his father wrote a letter back saying he gave full permission for Dad to actually join up and serve the country, which he did, and he finished up in northern France. I think it was the first early days of January 1916. Having sort of got himself involved, he finished up at the Somme. He was in the Royal Artillery, by the way. That was his regiment. And Father, apart from the Somme, also was firing the guns at Vimy Ridge, and they were supporting the Canadians who'd come over, obviously, as part of the Commonwealth troops, or Empire troops, I suppose, in those days. And they had a real great victory against the Germans, they really did, and despite the Germans counter-attacking on 2 or 3 occasions, could not shift them. And Dad was always a bit proud of that. That was a really successful episode in his life over there. He did get court-martialed once, actually. He'd written a letter to his mother, and obviously he was pretty well educated and he could do shorthand. And he wrote just a paragraph, obviously to his mum, in shorthand, because perhaps he felt a bit embarrassed at what he was saying to his mum. But of course the censors were all an educated bunch that were dealing with all this, and they could obviously read it and felt that he'd broken army rules. Even if he hadn't given any information away, he disobeyed what the military rules on the situation. And he was a sergeant at the time, and they demoted him very rapidly after the court-martial to the ammunition wagon lines, and he had to be taking the ammunition. That was a highly dangerous job at the best of the time. But there we go, that was just one of the... And in his war diary from the First World War, on that particular day, he'd written down, "I was a silly boy today." So he obviously... It didn't seem to concern him too much. He just made a sort of schoolboy error, really, I suppose. But then they fought on at various battles over the Bassett Canal and 1 or 2 other battles. And then early in July I think it was, of 1918, he'd been recommended for a commission. And it wasn't a field commission, though. They sent him back to Great Britain, to Weedon Cavalry Barracks, where he took his commission. But of course he didn't complete that. That was like a 6-month operation, and he started in July because the war ended in the November. So although he finished and came out as a young second lieutenant, he never went back to the battlefield. So he stayed in the territorial force until 1921, when it was disbanded, and he gave up his commission but not his rank. He kept his rank, as a lot of them did. And that was the end of that. He came back home and just got on with his life.
So what did he do in the years of peace between the
wars?
And the Second War?
Well, he was already an accomplished engineer. Grandfather was a mining engineer, as was his Uncle Frederick. And my grandfather was, he was what they called a fireman, but not as you would know it, putting fires out. He went down when they needed a new face. And he would drill, set the charges, blow the face, and then he would set the pit props, and then he would go back to his own little business, which was blacksmithing, which he employed 2 or 3 people. So that was his job. And then when he retired, his other son, the elder brother, Frederick, he took over and did the same job until, well, it would be, I suppose, in the late 20s, perhaps early 30s. Meanwhile, Father had been working for the Regent Cinema Company, which was all round the Midlands, and when talkies came in, Dad was accomplished enough to be able to rewire all the theatres so they could have the speakers in, and you could watch all the new modern films. But then at some point, Gaumont British bought them out, and they had all their own engineers already accomplished at setting up talkies, and Father was made redundant. So he said, "Okay, fair dues, I'll come south," which he did, joined Marconi's, and had a very successful career there, as far as I know, and what people have told me. He did his bit.
He was highly thought of, wasn't he? You shared the same name, John, but there was a twist there.
His name was John James, and he was always called Jack. And of course, as a youngster, I was called Young Jack, and it always irritated me, so I have no idea where all that came from. There's some historical sort of reason for it, I suppose. Whilst I was at Marconi's, I eventually went to Marconi's as well, and I was working with George Nichols in production engineering development, designing special purpose equipment for the company rather than buying it in. And I was coming back from the print room one day with some drawings that I'd done and had printed, and I was stopped by one of the directors of the company, Mike Wolfe, a very elegant man in his white pinstripe suit and grey hair slicked back, and he stopped me in the corridor and said, "You're working with George Knowles, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Latham, is it your name Latham?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You're not Jack Latham's boy, are you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And all he did was pat me on the shoulder and say, "Fine engineer," and walked off and left me standing there, feeling a bit proud, but wasn't quite sure what this was all about. And I wandered back to the drawing board and got on with my work, you know.
He was nicknamed Jack, as John
Yeah.
often are.
Oh, right,
and
yes.
you were known
Yeah,
as Jack Jr.
Yeah, he did. I must say, when he first stopped me, he did say, were you Jack Latham's boy?"
You have something there, scroll, that I'd like you to unscroll
Yeah.
and show the cameras. That's a photograph of Admiral Grant. Tell us about it.
It's one that was given to my father in 1946 by Admiral Grant, who was the managing director throughout the war. It's one that was given to my father by Admiral Grant when the war ended. Well, the war had ended, but Admiral Grant was leaving 1946, and he gave this to my father, which he signed personally in ink at the bottom left-hand corner, as I look at it. Yes. Yours sincerely, to J.J. Latham, yours sincerely, Admiral Grant, 1946. And it's after Dad had died, this was just one of the many possessions that he had, and I never really got to the bottom of why he was given it and what was the reason. I tried twice now on Chelmsford Remembered and posted it with the type, the written personal note at the bottom, but no one came up with any information at all, apart from one lady who said her husband said he'd seen it in the house that's adjacent to Springfield House on the green there. There was a property down the side there, and apparently I think it was Lord somebody that was living there at the time. I'm talking about mid-60s, early 60s. And apparently this gentleman has seen it in a frame hanging on the wall in there, and that is the only person that is, of all the thousands now that watch Chelmsford Remembered, who came up with any information about it. So if there's anyone out there that knows the true story to all this, and have they got one, and why were they given, I would appreciate it just to put a little bit more of the jig puzzle of Dad's life in place. Because although he told me a lot of things, there's an awful lot that I never knew about and he never chose to speak about. So
you're going to tell us the Dunkirk episode, the great escape that your father had at Dunkirk, which is, we know, the subject of an incredible war film.
Yeah, right. I'm going to read extracts from the diary of 1983782 Sapper John James Latham of the 108th Essex Electrical and Mechanical Company, Royal Engineers, and they were territorial soldiers. He found himself in, he joined up actually in 1936. And of course, 1939, war came, and the Territorial Army became the major part of the British Expeditionary Force, because the regular army were all over the world. So September 1939, he found himself back in northern France, where he finished up in the First World War. So basically, reading from his diary, which I've still got, and he obviously filled it in diligently whilst he was there. They arrived at Cherbourg on Saturday the 30th of September 1939. From there they travelled to Laval and then to Labat, and 3 days there, after 3 days there, they returned to Liebecourt, Pas de Calais. Now that's where Father had been a lot of the time by the end of the First World War, and he'd made a lot of friends in the village, Saint-Jean-Goël. And he was able to pick up with an awful lot of those friends, including Olga Poirier, who obviously when he was there would probably have been a 17-year-old young lady like my father. and they'd obviously corresponded right through, right through up to the Second World War. But from then on, May 1940, they left Lieberkorps and went by road. He was in charge of a Bren gun to Brussels in Belgium, obviously, and with a view to doing what, I'm not quite sure, but in his diary he said they were rubbish billets, not very comfortable at all, and then he finished up on guard duty for most of the night. In fact, on the Tuesday the 14th of May, he states here he'd been on guard 24 hours, and also commented that the Germans were bombing all the time, and the thousands of refugees on the roads. Why they needed to do that, he could never work out. But he said you could hear the guns going off all over the place in the distance, so there was obviously a lot of battles going on. I'll read from his diary the days, so you get some idea of the time factor involved in here. Then Wednesday the 15th of May, he was in charge of a Bren gun at the dump where they used to keep all their stuff. But Jerry made a lot of visits and kept dropping, but didn't drop no bombs on that particular Wednesday. Thursday the 16th, all quiet around, except for Jerry planes. Afterwards they bombed and machine gunned the roads and the civvies all through the afternoon. But they were ordered to leave. Let me think, where was he? He was at, no, where was he? He was still in Brussels, obviously, sorry, do apologise. He was still in Brussels, but they were then asked to pack off and left at 10:30. Obviously something was up. Nada House arrived there at 6 AM, hung around all day till 8:30, and then the Germans were back again bombing us. Then we moved off at 9 PM and I had a 6-inch howitzer. Saturday the 18th, arrived at Berchem, 12 o'clock, slept in the local dance hall, again bombed all night. Evacuees by the tens of thousands. Off again at 11:30. Sunday the 19th, arrived at Nanine, 7:30, slept in the cotton mill this time. Food for the first time for 3 days, so you give some idea of how horrible it all was. It was all falling apart very rapidly. Jerry again was busy with their planes, and apparently they caught a suspected spy, but he didn't actually say what happened to them, so presumably he or she was handed over to the local gendarmerie. They then left Nanine and arrived at Haru, I think that's how it's spelled, Haru, later in the day. Monday, more evacuees on the roads, total congestion, very difficult to travel. Jerry planes all over the place, all night, bombed and machine gunned. 3 Jerry planes down, luckily, so some of our lads obviously were good shots. Stan Bell was with me on the Bren gun. Tuesday the 21st, heard Lieberkorps had been bombed again, so I was hoping that all those that I knew and met and were safe, and no harm had come to them. Otherwise it was the usual Royal Engineers routine with the Bren gun, doing our bit, but we moved off again at 5 PM. Wednesday, arrived in Belle-Île, I think that's pronounced, but we were at stand to all the time. We didn't relax because we're going to get a move sooner or later and got to go. Thursday the 23rd, still here. Missed a good chance at the Jerry as well. Bloody gun jammed, but there was plenty of activity going on at the time. Friday the 24th, Revalia at 6 PM, on the way to Kemmel. Bombed and machine gunned all the way. Jerry, Lieutenant Leatherwood was wounded, so we left him behind with some of the medical staff. Had to leave Kemmel, and we had to sleep in the open that night, which wasn't very nice, because a bomb burst about 50 yards away from us, and apart from being machine gunned all the time, we were worrying whether we were going to ever get to the coast at all. Saturday the 25th, we counted 24 Jerry planes bombing us, and it seemed they were coming in from all directions, so none of us got any sleep at all. At 10 p.m. we packed at once and we're off. We were told we've got to move as quickly as possible from Kemmel to Marquette. We arrived there in the early morning, very early morning, took over an old dump, but again we had the same heavy aerial activity all day. Sunday the 26th, rain and bombing all day by 19 planes, and we haven't seen an English plane for 7 days, so we don't know what on earth is happening. We destroyed our dump at 6 o'clock, left everything and retired. Machine gunned and bombed on our way. Monday the 27th, we arrived at Hoogstad at 8 p.m. last night. Terrible passage, thought I was done for. We stopped all day but were bombed again, destroyed all the vehicles, rations and kit, and then had to march to the coast 15 miles. We started at 6 p.m, marched till 7 a.m. Actually we did 25 miles. Everyone dead beat. I carried a Bren gun all the way and I had very, very sore feet. We managed to get onto the beaches at Braydoon, which was a little north of Dunkirk, because all hell had broken out there, and we really couldn't get in. It was much too dangerous. So we went a little further north. 28th of Tuesday the 28th, the minesweeper of Salamander had pulled in closest to the coast and put her whalers down, and they were coming along the coast, picking up all of us that were on that particular beach at that time, and then taking us back to the Salamander, where we got our first cup of tea, etc., etc. We had to swim to the whalers to get out there because they couldn't get in close enough to shallow water. We waited on board Salamander all night because the whalers were going up and down the coast all night picking up everybody that turned up, which was very courageous of them despite the bombing and machine gunning that was going on. They then, when they filled her up as many as she could carry, she went out into the deeper water where HMS Calcutta, a cruiser, was waiting, and she got everybody successfully onto it, including my dad and all his mates. And she managed to get to Sheerness safely. It took a 5-hour trip, but she got there, but despite being attacked, and they got back to good old England, good old Blighty, if you like, I suppose they called it in those days. And then Thursday the 30th, he says, glad to be back on British soil, had a lovely breakfast, a bath, the first shave for 4 days, and then on to Devizes, the army camp there. But they did stop on the way at Canterbury, where the St John's ambulance and the territorial soldiers as well were issuing mugs of tea and sandwiches for all the lads through the windows. And then Dad, after he got back to Devizes and got himself organised, him and 2 or 3 others went AWOL and hitched lifts on the road back to London. And then from London, Dad made it back to Chelmsford and back to Mother, his wife Agnes, and myself, young John. And 2 days after that, whilst Father was there, a letter came from the War Office saying that your husband is reported missing, may have been killed, but could be a prisoner of war, and if that's the case and he contacts you, will you please inform us immediately? Well, subsequently he rejoined his regiment, as did all the other lads, and they didn't get into trouble because I think everybody was knew what everybody was feeling. They were very bizarre times, and nobody quite knew what the hell was happening. Then he was whizzed off to the regiment was whizzed off to Scotland on some course or other, and whilst he was there, the older ones were all called before the commanding officer, and he leant back in his chair and said, the War Office in their wisdom have decided not to kill the old ones off first, go and get a travel warrant, go back home and do something useful for the war effort. And that really was the end of Dad's military career. 2 world wars, and he survived them all. So I think he was born under a lucky star. He went back to Marconi's, and so life carried on. I got in my hand is a letter that I sent, and is recorded on the website, to the survivors and the association of those that are associated with HMS Salamander, who saved my father and all the rest of the lads. And this is how it goes. They printed it very kindly. A message from the son of a soldier rescued by Salamander. I would just like to thank you to all the lads that are still alive who served on the Salamander for getting my father, Sapper John James Latham, 108 Royal Engineers, away safely to Calcutta and thence to Sheerness. My father's diary quotes all details accurately, how he swam to the Salamander at 10 p.m. on the evening of the 28th of May and remained with you all night as you picked up others, leaving aboard the Calcutta at 2:15 for Sheerness. I was only 2.5 at the time, but reading the Salamander's ship's logs of the terrible events you endured in the subsequent days, I feel very proud of you all. There must be so many families who have thanked you for bringing their men back home safely, yet are totally unaware of such courage and heroism. God bless all of you who are still with us. Well done, lads, to those who are not. Kindest regards, John Latham. And then I had a P.S. Father was 43 years old at the time and had already done his bit in the 1418 war. He must have been born under a lucky star. And they printed it, and that's still there to this day. I printed that off yesterday.
And in conclusion, what would you like to tell our viewers?
It seemed we were at school, history lessons. We covered everything up to the First World War. They felt they couldn't teach us beyond that because so many were still alive, and being a sensible country in those days, they felt they couldn't and should do it. So that was it. We finished at the Boer War and Waterloo, etc. But there aren't many left now from the First World War, and certainly very few, if any at all, from Dunkirk. There might still be 1 or 2. And I think it's 75 years ago now. They should be taught. They need to know what so many people, boys, men and women, boys and girls, did to keep this country safe over a period of 100 years. And don't take for granted your life at the moment. The real world is a very dangerous place. It always has been. Nothing's changed. But this little old island of ours, we've been immune to most of it. And when we've been threatened, we've always stood our ground and we survived. I would say to the young ones today, do read about it, do take it in, because you may have to do it yourself one day, unless you're just going to give in, which would be a great shame, because there'll be an awful lot of old soldiers and sailors and airmen right above you looking down and saying, what is the matter with these people? Why did we do that? Why did we die? It was pointless. So that's what I would like to see, a little more thought for those that went before.